So, kia ora koutou everyone, and welcome, and I would just like to open things out by saying that working in healthcare is hard. You gotta deal with superbugs, you gotta deal with short staffing, you gotta deal with night shifts, and you gotta fight the moon. Or do ya? That's what we're going to find out today, everyone. I'm hoping that by the end of this talk we have a bit of a better understanding of some of the superstitions that exist in healthcare, and hopefully some insight on how these actually affect you in your day-to-day life, and for anyone medical here, your own practice. So I'd just like to start with a bit of an introduction of myself. My name is Dr. Robin Page. I am the medical kind, which means I didn't have to study for as long or as hard as my PhD colleagues. I didn't have to fight for funding. I didn't have to publish papers. I just had to get top 10% in some exams in first year and then try not to cry too much for the following 5. And then I get a job in the public sector, which is nice and safe. As kind of quoted to, I work in the emergency department at Nite ChCh Hospital. I own 8 different helmets, which makes me a walking stereotype of an emergency doctor. I am not sponsored by Coca-Cola or any of the other fizzy drink companies, but I would save a significant amount of money if I were. So I'm not saying I'm open to bribery, but I'm open to bribery. Lastly, I've just included a picture of here with my son. His name is Dumpling. He is a 1.5 meter long plushy koi fish. He follows me around the country. Last time I took him driving, my 4-wheel drive got stuck in a snowdrift. I would like to start off with a question. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you here in the audience today come from some kind of healthcare or first responder background? So doctors, nurses, paramedics, police, fire, anything like that. Quick show of hands. Now I'm going to say something to you you're not going to like. I think your next shift is going to be a quiet one. For those of you who don't know what just happened, I just said the one thing you do not say to first responders. Because as the superstition goes, you tell someone it's going to be a quiet shift, it will be anything but. So if anyone wants to come find me afterwards and have some stern words about your next shift, you know where to find me. But here's the thing, right? We're evidence-based people. We follow the research, we follow the data. Is there actually any data that's saying the word quiet makes your shift worse? Turns out a bunch of people have asked this exact question of the so-called Q fever. So here we have a study from 2017 from a UK orthopedics department who said absolutely it actually does. But we also have here from 2019 a study from a UK microbiology department where they actually did a randomized controlled trial on the word quiet. They had 2 sets of envelopes, some that said quiet, some that didn't, mixed them up, and at the start of each shift, they'd open one out, and if it said the word quiet, they'd say it's going to be a quiet shift. And then they'd document their data on how busy that shift was, and they found no statistically significant difference between the two. Go figure. And lastly, also from 2019, our colleagues over in veterinary emergency medicine did a study very similar. They looked at the emergency services, how many people came in, how many required to be hospitalized when the word was said quiet, and they found no difference. So, having presented that data to you now, how many of you that absolutely shit the bed when I said your shift's going to be quiet now think you're going to be okay? Turns out, a lot of you don't. Because although we're evidence-based, we still are scared of the word quiet. Why is that? We're going to dive into that a little bit. First of all, we're going to think of some other superstitions. So there's the so-called they come in threes, which I actually experienced today. I had one person come in with an emergency involving their eye. I don't see those very often. And what do you think the next 2 were? There's the concept of the speak of the devil, which is, say you have a particular pathology you haven't seen come in a while, or a particular person you haven't seen come in a while. And you might walk up to your colleague and say, hey, I haven't seen so-and-so in a while. Guess who the next person in the queue is going to be? You guessed it, that person. And lastly, the one I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about, the full moon syndrome. So what is the full moon syndrome? The full moon is the idea that if there is a full moon in the sky tonight, work is going to be batshit crazy, especially at night in the emergency department. So if you go into work knowing it's going to be a full moon, you are all hands on deck. You are ready to go. But the question is Is this backed by data? Is this real? This is a question I decided I want to find out. So, in my first year as a doctor, when you work in the general medical department, you are required to do a research paper or an audit. I personally am of the opinion that forced research is the worst kind of research. Because you get people who don't want to be there, who don't want to do it, that are going to produce rubbish quality data and maybe even just straight up lie in order to get their paper done. It's called a PhD, exactly. Except this one I didn't even get funding for, I just had to do it in my spare time. And so because I'm the malicious compliance type, I decided if I'm going to be made to do an audit, if I'm going to be made to do a paper, I'm going to do something I want to know the answer to, and they are not going to stop me. I also wanted to do something that I could stand up in front of a department and make a straight face and say, here's my research, you cannot stop me. So I decided to see if full moons affect the admissions to our general medical department at Christ Church Hospital. Now, there's a real reason why you might want to do this, because think about it, right? If you have a reliable, consistent predictor of department workload, you can roster around that. If you know that every full moon things are going to go to hell in a handbasket, you can just roster more staff. Where you're going to get those staff from is a very different question. But you could. So this is the question I sought to answer. My control group was days where it was not a full moon, pretty easy to spot. You just look out the window and go, no werewolves. And then my exposure group was days that had a full moon. Now, in the interests of transparency, I did allow for a day either side, because sometimes a full moon doesn't exactly fall midday of the day that you're doing. It might overlap a little bit, so to allow for kind of that latent lunar power, shall we say, I included days on either side, just for the fairness of the data. I collected 3 years worth of data. So this covered when we had the old hospital and when we covered the new one to see if perhaps one of those buildings was more moon resistant. You never know. The new ED is on the bottom floor of an 8-floor building. That's a lot of lunar protection. The old one only had 2. And so, here's what we found. So we've got our normal group here. This is days without a full moon. We have a mean number of admissions per day to the general medical department of 40 people, a median of 41, and a mode of 39. Interestingly, the quietest day had only 4 people, which I think is a lie. I have never seen only 4 people coming in a day to general medicine. They get like 4 people a minute. On the other hand, the maximum number of people in a single day was 67. Compare that to our full moon data. Initially, things look promising. Our mean data is 42. But if you look at those standard deviations, if you look at those confidence intervals, they actually overlap. So that's statistically insignificant. What gets interesting is you look at the median and the mode. They are identical. But, that might not be the full story. Maybe you do just sometimes get some really outlier busy days on full moons. No, turns out you don't. Busiest day was 61. That's less than the non-full moon days. So, does the international data stack up with this? Turns out people have been doing studies on full moon syndrome since 1980. That's 43 years of data. That's like almost twice as long as I've been alive. So going all the way back to 80. One of the psych journals, Perceptual and Motor Schools, did a study on rates of people presenting with acute overdose to emergency departments. No difference. 1989, trauma surgeons did a study on whether people coming to emergency department would get more trauma cases coming in over a 1-year period. No difference. 1996, one of the EDs, effect checked over a 4-year period, very similar study to mine, no difference. And lastly, 2004, again, an emergency department study, not only no effects on number of admissions, there's also no effect on the severity. So it's not like people were sicker or getting in faster car crashes or anything, just no difference whatsoever. So, again, seeing all this data, do we think that full moon syndrome exists? I heard a yes. And that's what we're going to talk about next. I thought that might happen. So, why does every single first responder and emergency care worker have a story about full moon syndrome working? Because we all do. I've had it myself. We think, okay, the data says this. That's great and all. Data's wonderful. But I'm special because I've seen it happen. It happened to me once. Or it happened to a guy who knew a guy who was cousins with a guy who saw it happen. Why is that? Why is it that we all have stories of full moon days being hell in a handbasket when the data says completely otherwise? For those who are not familiar with the placebo and nocebo effects, I've taken the privilege of giving a brief, very dictionary description of it, which is a medicine or a procedure which is prescribed for a psychological benefit to a patient rather than any physiological effect. Now that's a whole lot of gobbledygook. Basically what it means is if you believe it works, it works. And the nocebo effect is if you think it's going to hurt you, it's going to hurt you. How does this apply to superstition? Well, here's a wonderful study about placebo effects on patients with irritable bowel syndrome. What they wanted to see is that, will a placebo effect work if you know you are under the effect of a placebo effect? Right? So irritable bowel syndrome is a collection of symptoms for which we don't always have a hard medical explanation. We've said, you don't have bowel cancer, you're not allergic to gluten, sorry. You don't have a nasty autoimmune condition that attacks the lining of your gut and makes you poop out blood. Some people are really sad when you tell them they don't have that. I don't understand why. Basically, we haven't found a medical cause for your unusual gut symptoms, but they're still there regardless. And so, because we don't know what's causing it, it's quite hard to find a treatment that works because we don't know the physiology and how to effectively target it, whether that's with surgical interventions, pharmacological interventions, choose what you will. So, often we have to get a little bit creative, shall we say. And one such study, they took the patients and they said, I am going to prescribe you a placebo medication, but I think it'll help you. And it said on the jar, placebo contains sugar pills. And they gave it to these patients, and they had a control group on whom they did not intervene on. And guess what? They got better. They reported statistically significant improvements in their symptoms. Even though they knew they were taking placebos, it still worked. So, what does that have to do with superstition? Well, if you think about what superstition is, it's a fixed belief. I can throw all this data at you that tells you certain things do not happen because of the moon, or because I said the word quiet, but you intrinsically believe it will, and so it will. Your perception of your environment will change. If you go to work knowing it's a full moon out, and you believe in your heart of hearts that it's going to be a bad shift, guess what? It's going to be a bad shift, regardless of what the numbers say. That is an example of nocebo effect. You believe something is going to have a negative impact on yourself, and so it does, no matter what the actual data says. Remember, we have 43 years of data disproving this, and yet we all still believe it. We all still buy into it. That's how strongly ingrained these cultural biases are, and how influential placebo and nocebo effects are. So what can we draw from this? Why does this matter? Well, first of all, coming from a career, a profession, that prides itself on evidence-based practice, we read our journals, we do our studies, we do our research, we're still a really superstitious lot. If you think about it, we haven't really moved so far from the reading the blood in the entrails and using weird spectrums of light to look into someone, because I've just described CT scanners and biochemical laboratories. We're not so different. We haven't come that far in 300 years. In addition to this, most of the time, these superstitions aren't actually backed up by evidence, and we love evidence, we love data, but we aren't immune to our own biases, and more importantly, we aren't immune to them even if we know they exist. That's how strong these biases are, and that's what I want all of you to take away and have a think about, is what are your biases? What are your superstitions that you hold on to? And even if I could give you overwhelming evidence that they don't exist, would you still believe them? And would they still affect how you interact with the world around you? The answer, by the way, is yes. In addition to this, I think we can pretty summarily put away the idea that we can improve hospital staffing using a lunar model. And lastly, I don't think we have any way just yet of predicting whether your next shift is going to be a quiet shift. Thank you. Now's the time you get to heckle.
Have we got any midwives in the crowd? Do they connect with the lunar cycle?
I would love to hear from a midwife about your experience with lunar cycles.
Not a midwife, sorry.
Okay.
But I am a librarian, and working in public libraries, I'm a staunch believer of the lunar effect. How many of the studies were qualitative as well as quantitative? So thinking about not necessarily just the number of people coming to the emergency department, but the level of sanity of the people coming into it.
So for those who couldn't hear that, the question is qualitative versus quantitative studies. How many measure the intensity or perhaps the insanity of the people? I've been asked this in other ways, including how many people grew lots of hair and started barking like a dog. Unfortunately, my data was not able to check that. I'm limited by the technology of my time and what people put in their medical records. However, if we sort of were to flick back to some of those other studies, the one study, for example, was a comparison of not only number of admissions, but the acuity and severity based on triage codes. So is this a triage for someone stubbed their toe and came in very, very sad? Was this a triage when someone wrapped a car around the tree? So not all the studies, mind you, measured acuity, but some of them have, and actually they showed no evidence either. But absolutely an angle I've definitely thought about and had many sleepless nights over as the full moon blares in through my uncurtained windows.
Knowing what you know now, how does that influence your practice?
So for me, it's really important to kind of check sort of biases going into a shift. There was an ICU doctor I worked for a while back who had an absolutely fantastic way of starting his shifts. Every day at the start of a morning ward round, he would sit the team down and say, "All right, team, here are 3 things about my day today that are going to influence how I practice." It could be that you are on call lots overnight, and so you haven't had much sleep, and you might be a bit shorter and crankier than usual. It could be that your team won at sports ball last night, and you're really excited and amped up because you won the world champs, and so you're in a great mood. Or it could be that you've seen the list and gone, "Oh God, we've got 40 people to see. I'm not ready for this." And so letting your team know ahead of time, to a degree, what biases you are coming into your day with, and how to respond to that and plan for that accordingly, knowing that if I'm a bit short and snappy with you today, it's probably not your fault. I'm just incredibly sleep deprived. But equally, if I'm a bit over-enthusiastic and rushing through the round and missing things and skipping details and seeming like I'm not paying much attention, maybe I'm distracted by something. And let's account for that and work as a team and overcome these unconscious biases that I've ended up with. One of my, which ones? Worst full moon stories. Ooh, so I think my worst full moon story for the audience was currently working in the emergency department, where I've been for a couple of months now, where we had every single resuscitation bay occupied at the same time. To bear in mind, we have 5 of these things, and the moment you fill a resus bay, so you've got someone pretty sick, you've taken away 1 to 2 doctors, about 4 or 5 nursing staff, and a whole lot of equipment. Everyone's attention is gone. If they've got people allocated to themselves out in the rest of the department, you're getting ignored for the next hour. I'm really sorry. So on a night shift, we typically have about 6 or 7 doctors on, and then a few others on call if we need them. So imagine how the department looks when 5 of them are off the floor. Oh yeah, you get the picture.
Given the scientific proof that deception-free placebos work, have you taken this into your own practice?
Yeah, I prescribe paracetamol. Which does actually work clinically, by the way, just a lot of people don't think it does.
What's the weirdest thing you've seen someone shove up their butt?
Oh, I knew this question was coming.
You all want to know.
In person, or that I've seen case reports of? So if we go in person, I haven't actually seen that many because Christchurch Emergency Department has 4 main areas. You've got the kids unit, you've got the 2 adult acute units, and then you've got what we call our acute care unit, which is kind of like a GP clinic on steroids. And most of the up-the-butt stuff goes to the acute care clinic on steroids. So I'm only working there 1 in every 3 days, which means I often miss the days where we get to see those. But I do get to see the pictures because inevitably they're going to circle, anonymized and blanked out so you can't tell who it is. You're safe if any of you are here. But you see a lot of stuff. You see a lot of shampoo bottles for some reason, which it's always, I just slipped and fell in the shower and I haven't to have a condom on it. But the worst thing I've ever seen was an entire cutlery set. Knives, forks, and spoons.
Can I ask?
Asking for a friend. Before it gets too feral.